Vanakkam. Unfortunately, this is the only Tamil word I know. But as I was telling my colleague on the dais, there are some languages you don't need to know to understand. Anybody who's speaking it just now, and I just said what I told him, the alliteration, the musical tonality of the language interprets itself. And it's quite amazing how much of alliteration and music there is in that language, even for a person who is not otherwise well-versed in Tamil. Friends, all the esteemed persons on the dais, the Sutradhar, the host of this function, Mr. Elango, distinguished members of this very august audience, my colleague parliamentarians, distinguished journalists, lawyers, judges, members of civil society, and of course students. Ladies and gentlemen, this pleasant occasion of a memorial lecture is of course tinged with sadness and melancholy at the passing away of so young a life, at the demise of a young soul so full of promise and potentiality. But sometimes we are left with no other option than to remind ourselves or console ourselves with the saying that those whom the gods love die young. But we must all acknowledge the stoic dignity and the commendable courage with which Elango and his family have faced this tragedy. Their fortitude has been exemplary. I have known Elango for several years as a colleague at the bar, as a colleague in Parliament. His soft-spoken but steadfast commitment to core values has shone through consistently. He is a firm and dynamic believer in all his diverse responsibilities, but never brash, intrusive, or abrasive. Those qualities of head and heart must necessarily have been put to the test by this heart-rending tragedy. But he and his family have internalized this setback and have converted it to public good and public service by a series of charitable activities. I am sure God will give him and his family the continued courage and fortitude to bear this irreparable loss and the zeal to consecrate the memory of his son by so many laudable initiatives, many of which you have just heard about. Friends, we address the topic of pillars of Indian democracy in the 75th year of our republic. This topic is important in any year, at any phase of a nation's life, but it is particularly memorable in its 75th year. And it is also a topic which we must keep reminding ourselves of because it's so easy to take it for granted. And because it is easy to take democracy for granted, it is easy to take the values which underlie it for granted. And therefore, sometimes when we speak of this at lectures or interactions, we start learning how to cherish these core values. As far as pillars are concerned, there are institutional pillars which are more tangible, more visible, more known. But possibly if I was forced to choose the non-institutional pillars of Indian democracy would be even more important, less tangible, less visible, more abstract, but nevertheless fundamental pillars on which our democracy exists, stands. And therefore, any dilution or weakening of these pillars, the slightest diminution or the continuance of assaults, direct or indirect, explicit or implied, over a period of time, is again an issue which is linked. So while we celebrate we must acknowledge, we must perhaps mourn, and we must reform. Let me start by asking a question which I've asked so many audiences across the world. Of course, there is no answer to the question, both international and domestic. But that really links with the theme we are discussing today. The question is that from the 1930s to the 1950s or 60s, roughly 25, 30 years, there are several countries which emerged from the yoke of imperialism across the world. They emerged from British imperialism, from Dutch imperialism, from Belgian imperialism, from French imperialism, and so on and so forth, across the length and breadth of Australasia, Africa, South America, large swathes of territory. And yet, even in the 70s, 80s, and certainly now, you see only the wrecks and ruins of constitutionalism for each and every one of those who emerged from the yoke of imperialism. As far as democracy is concerned, maybe barring one or two exceptions, which I can't think about, India remains the shining exception, and certainly the only one near, even remotely near its size, the shining exception of a vibrant democracy which emerged in that period. So the question which I start with is, why? How? How is it possible that a country the size of India has achieved this? I frankly have really no answer. If I'm forced to give the answer, the honest, truthful answer, the first answer is sheer good luck. But if you dig a little deeper and you are forced to look for logical answers, then, and this is entirely a personal view, each person will have a different view. Each person will have a different perspective and should, in a democracy, have it. But the other answer I can think of is that we probably got the sequencing right. Of course, we got the sequencing right, not necessarily by design, but we just got it right. The sequencing being Gandhi first, followed by Nehru. There is possibly no more or greatest agitational politician across the globe at any point of time, no greater agitational politician than Gandhi. And without Gandhi, the idea of getting independence from the British might have remained at least a distant dream. And that he did it by non-violent means. He did it in a certain finite period of time is itself a miracle. And Gandhi's, of course, biggest weapon was that he had no hiatus between preaching and practice. But just consider what would have happened if Gandhi was the first Prime Minister of India. Gandhi, according to me, might have been just too idealistic to have been the Prime Minister of India. So we got the sequencing right in that we got Nehru following Gandhi, the eternal liberal, left of center, originally Fabian socialist, somewhat dreamy, romantic public figure, rooted, of course, in Gandhi and Gandhian philosophy, but also pragmatic on so many governance issues. Possibly a reversal of that sequence might not have produced the same results, because it is the first 20 years of a nascent republic where you need to dig in your roots and make it a firm democracy. Possibly the other South Asian neighbors we had would also have become democracies if those first 15 to 20 years had been allowed where you could dig in your heels for democracy. They could not, we could. And the fact that we could was largely because of Nehru. So having given you that backdrop, let me straight away turn to the more direct theme for today, the pillars of Indian democracy. But as I start on those several pillars, I must say with a deep sense of sadness and trepidation that many of the pillars I'm going to discuss with you have been either severely undermined or are in the process of being recast as pygmies and not pillars. The hiatus between preaching and practice is humongous. And as we go and discuss each of these pillars, non-institutional or institutional, we must underline, highlight the more insidious attempts to diminish these pillars, to dilute them. More insidious because it is camouflaged, covert, indirect, frequently devious and manipulative. And we have to guard against that. So this lecture is as much about identifying and celebrating those pillars as telling you how to be aware of their diminution. The first of those pillars, and a non-institutional pillar, is secularism. One of those most maligned words. But kindly consider it in this context. India is planet Earth's most diverse spot. There is no more or no greater diversity on planet Earth than India. Whether you call it a melting pot or a salad bowl, you cannot even imagine a congregation of 22 scheduled languages, 700 mother tongues, 2,000 dialects, the largest population of 4 religions, the second largest population or possibly the third largest population of Muslims, diversity of smells, sounds, dresses, races, ethnicities, foods, rituals. There is no end to these parameters. In this context, secularism is never a largesse which you offer to citizens. It is actually a self-preservatory ethic. Selfish India, for self-interest, requires secularism much more than anybody else to whom we are supposed to be showering it. There is no doubt that it's been a defaced and attacked and somewhat diluted word. It has even become a subject of comic sarcasm. So I looked for an appropriate definition of secularism, and I found probably one of the good, simple ones by Professor Rajiv Bhargav, formerly of Harvard University. He adapted the Lincolnian phrase, of the people, by the people, for the people, and said, we can understand for the people. Democracy is for the people. By the people we can understand because it's voting by the people. He said, why did Lincoln use the phrase of the people? That's an odd phrase to use. And then he answered the question himself saying that of the people is supposed to convey a sense of co-ownership of democratic India to each of its inhabitants. It is supposed to be like a joint family ownership, a co-ownership. Some small amount is co-owned by each person. And that brings in automatically so many different concepts of inclusion, of participation. Indeed, the other 2 words of the preamble, which have been there, and secularism was not there earlier, as you know, are also linked inextricably, fraternity and equality. These are all concepts from the preamble and in operational reality which cross-fertilize each other. Yes, secularism found its way much later, about 25 years down the line in our republic in 1976. There is a debate going on out there whether it should at all be there. Some people say it's inherent. Some people say it's not necessary to put it there. But the real point is that if it is inherent, it is far so important that it must be explicitly underlined. So when it was brought in 1976 onwards, it is certainly a jewel in the crown, and it is a non-derogable jewel in the crown. There is no doubt that it is part of the basic structure of the Indian Constitution. As you know, the basic structure of the Indian Constitution is a remarkable doctrine, which is the pride of India and the envy of the world, and many nations have copied it. It's a remarkable doctrine because it says that even a constitutional amendment by a 2/3 majority of Parliament in its constituent amending power, even a constitutional amendment can be declared unconstitutional. So when you understand these ramifications, the limits, the boundaries of secularism, when you understand the context of India itself, you realize very fast that you cannot have imposition of uniformity upon diversity. You cannot convert unity in diversity, a much bandied phrase, into uniformity upon diversity. You cannot contemplate deliberate injections of hate speech, of divisive politics, especially when they come from persons of pelf, power, or patronage. And you need to recognize the obvious again and again, because if you don't recognize, you begin to take it for granted, and after recognition, you need to speak up about it when you can, where you can. Otherwise, what will apply to you is that old famous saying, when they came for the Jews, nobody spoke up, and when they came for the Christians, you did not speak up. And when they came for somebody else, you kept silent. When they came for you, there was nobody to speak up for you. Friends, continuing on the theme of secularism for a few moments more, our neighbor Pakistan imploded shortly after independence. Today it is teetering on the brink of extinction. Have Indian standards fallen so low that we are now reduced to comparing ourselves to Pakistan? I was quite intrigued, indeed I would say dismayed and stunned, to find the Indian finance minister using Pakistan's diminishing minority population as a comparator for Indian secularism. Were it not coming from a high constitutional post holder, it would be both contemptible and laughable. Apart from being a false and misleading non-comparator, the very reference to Pakistan as a standard shows the depths we are plumbing. And if the minuscule minority population of Pakistan, a self-professedly theocratic state, has declined, can it be a reference point to the world's largest democracy, with possibly the third largest concentration of a particular minority? And their expanding numbers, can those numbers, which are anyway so high, both in percentage and absolute terms, be ever expected to diminish? And can therefore the Finance Minister of India exult because they have not diminished in India, and use that as a comparator? Then again, now these are, of course, I have traveled from the philosophical, conceptual idea of secularism to the practical, operational reality, which is what I'm going to do for each pillar. I'm going to tell you the concept of the pillar. I'm going to tell you the philosophical underlying idea of the pillar. But I'm also have to be honest with you and to be frank and candid, telling you the current contemporary state of that pillar. So then again, irrespective of rhetorical slogans like Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, can India or its largest state, Uttar Pradesh, which is the size of Europe, in fact exceeding that size, justify what is this new, I've never in my long years of practice or otherwise heard of this bulldozer Raj. And bulldozer Raj to the power of 2, because it's actually targeted against specific communities. Is this our way of extending assurance, trust and faith to groups and communities, which is the heart of secularism? One amazingly delightful facet of this innovative, state-conducted, terrifying tactic called bulldozer Raj is that 5 or 7-year-old notices for minor infractions of building bylaws, which are either regularizable or compoundable or are pending with no action taken, are not acted upon for 5 or 7 years. But the moment the occupant of that property participates in a protest or a demonstration against the powers that be, that notice is activated and the bulldozer arrives shortly to wreak to wreak consequences, precisely because you have joined a protest or a morcha against the ruling party. And this is all done in the midst of applause. It is done in the midst of cleaning up the system kind of thinking. So this is unfortunately the true scope of this vital non-institutional pillar of democracy, but sadly also some of its distortions. I now turn to a second vital non-institutional pillar of Indian democracy, federalism. It's quite interesting. I did a Google search many years ago of the Indian Constitution, and I found federal word 20, 30 times. So I was very intrigued because as far as I know, this pillar of the Indian Constitution, something which is fundamental, does not find any mention in the whole Indian Constitution. And mind you, the Indian Constitution is one of the largest in the world. It's among the 10 longest constitutions. So when I checked up my Google search, I found that all the references to federalism were actually to the federal court, which preceded and pre-existed the Supreme Court. There is no word called federalism in the Indian Constitution. But yet, it is part of our basic structure. So just imagine how interesting, ironical, and important it is that federalism, a word not found in the preamble, not found in the Constitution, is part of our basic structure. It was held so even before, but certainly from Bommai onwards. Bommai is a 1994 judgment. From Bommai onwards, federalism has been held by 9 judges to be part of the basic structure. So what I'm going to spend some time on now is how the designers of India and the Indian Constitution, for a variety of very, very clever and very, very far-sighted people, I don't think we ever can match the far-sightedness and the depth and the genius of our Constituent Assembly, howsoever much we might think that we are the cat's whiskers. But those people, while cognizant of the need for federalism, actually designed at inception a largely unitary structure. They were very scared because of the fissiparous tendencies rampant around them, because of the riots, the killings, and they were really scared, and the debates of the Constituent Assembly show that India might not survive as a single unit. So by design, they created a largely unitary structure. Not as unitary as England, but largely unitary. And what I'm going to discuss in the second part of this is how that designed, deliberate, broadly unitary structure, by accidental and inadvertent federalism, has become very, very much more federal. And it's called accidental and inadvertent federalism, not as per constitutional design. And then in the third part of this, I will tell you, of course, the diluting, distorting, and damaging features of federalism in practice today. Now, the first part is interesting because it has been considered always that federalism is like a safety valve. It's like a pressure cooker which we use in our kitchens because it lets off steam. Federalism manages diversities. It's in that sense a close cousin of secularism. It manages the 3 Ds: dissent, dissatisfaction, and a feeling of discomfort. It localizes disputes at the regional level and does not allow them all to reach the national top level where they would explode with greater ferocity. But when it started, since we were influenced very much by the British system, I mean, there are very few truly federal countries. A truly federal country would be USA, where there were pre-existing nations like Louisiana and Alaska and other places, which were either purchased or gave up their sovereignty to become part of the US. Almost 1/3 or 1/4 of USA were independent countries which gave the sovereignty up to come into the US Union. And therefore, that was a truly federal, bottom-up federation. India is a top-down federation where it's a union of states with few federating features. So the Australian jurist Kenneth Weir in the 50s and 60s called it quasi-federal, which meant basically unitary with a few federal features. The fascinating story is how that largely unitary system has, in operational reality, become, in fact, hugely more federal, which is why the attacks on federalism for the last few years should be treated as more alarming. In actual practice, there are 6 federating influences which have worked in the last 75 years to make India a much, much, much more federal system than our designers designed in the Constituent Assembly. The first of those 6 is, of course, linguistic federalism. And nobody knows it better than states like Tamil Nadu or Maharashtra. Those of us who have, and I was certainly very young then, and I don't know much about it, but many of you here would know about the language riots of the 60s. Well, good, bad, or indifferent, some 3-language formula, a lot of leeway to states, a much more accommodative stance on regional languages, contained them. And I don't know of any major disruptions. There have been, of course, aberrations on that issue from the 60s. But what is the creation of states on linguistic lines but a huge, huge advance of linguistic federalism? States reorganization on linguistic lines, you may have different views about it, but it is a huge amount of federalism in action, but linguistic federalism. And broadly, the language formulas we are using has stood the test of time. I am, of course, always intrigued, as a side comment on this subtopic about linguistic federalism, that the government of India must have spent crores or hundreds of crores to propagate Hindi. In Parliament also we get things parallelly in Hindi. I get all kinds of official reports. I've been chairman of many parliamentary committees. I get English and Hindi. But really, the actual effect of promotion of Hindi by those governmental initiatives has been very limited. And it has been coupled with many governments using it as a camouflage for forceful imposition. The moment you let go and you do not have forceful imposition, you have found Hindi flourishing. You'll be surprised, and one of the reasons I ascribe, my personal view, is the media explosion of the 80s and 90s in particular, the visual media explosion. The visual media, with now 570 or 600 channels and all these media houses, people from all communities, all regions, where there is no imposition, there is no compulsion, there is no force, there is no overt act, go in a natural way. And in the old days before OB vans, we used to go with my South Indian friends, not only from Tamil Nadu, but from different states, who would speak in a very natural way when they wanted in English and Hindi, broken here and there, because it was in a natural, spontaneous way. That probably has done more for Hindi than all the imposition and all the official language reports which have come from official sources. The second federating influence in the last 60, 70 years has been vigorous judicial review. It is interesting that, of course, the biggest public enemy number 1 of federalism, Article 356, from 2000 till now, 20 years, would hardly have been used about 10, 12 times. I don't remember the exact figure. Now, it's not merely a case of more sensible governments. Every government in power at the center loves to have the deadly tool of 356, which is the most anti-federal provision seen by many people, although it may be considered necessary in the Constitution. But why in practice has this anti-federal provision been so diluted? Because of vigorous, prompt, and last-mile remedial judicial review in the last 20 years. The cases of takeover of governments or toppling of governments or destabilizing of governments, and they not only relate to 356, but they relate to all forms of destabilization, which means defections, 356, inducements, and of course, other forms of attack contrary to the numbers. They've all met with prompt judicial action. Rameshwar took a few years, which is considered long. Ramakrishna Hegde won the Bommai case, but by then 3 governments had changed by the time the Bommai judgment came. But subsequent to that, Karnataka, Bihar, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, Uttarakhand, second Karnataka, Goa, Arunachal Pradesh, in each of this, wherever there has been illegality or intrusion into elected governments by external forces, frequently the central government or central government ruling parties, they've all met with prompt reaction, decisions in weeks, days and months. I've been privileged to be part of almost each one of them. And it is that which has reduced, significantly reduced, the over 100 exercises of 356 till 2000, followed by about 15 or 11 or 12 post 2000. Because the judiciary on this subject has walked the talk. The last judgment which is reserved, where we had the privilege of arguing, both your first lecturer and your second lecturer, is reserved. But that itself is considered quite late. It took about a year. But a year is a short time compared to what the earlier judgments used to take. Had this judgment been decided within a few weeks, the Eknath Shinde matter, possibly some outcomes would have been different. But by and large, this is the very important salutary second federating influence which has made operational India a more federal country, not designed constitutional India. The third, possibly the most important in numbers, is Panchayati Raj. I remember, because I was standing next to him when Rajiv Gandhi telephoned my father and said, Dr. Singhvi, you give long lectures on Panchayati Raj and you are considered a learned person in that subject. But everywhere around us, Panchayati Raj is lying in wreck and ruin. So I'm immediately appointing you the head of a committee for revitalization of Panchayati Raj. This is in the late 80s, 86 to be precise. My father's report came in the late 80s and led to the 92 amendment to the Constitution, which brought in this whole set of provisions from ZZ and ZQ and all that for municipalities and Panchayati Raj. But that is the most remarkable federating influence of the Indian Union. When I go as a member of parliament to my home state, Rajasthan, and now I'm from West Bengal, 50% of the time sitting opposite me is a woman who is the head of the panchayat or is the head of the local body. She's taking decision. There are 2 million women in positions of power, which was unthinkable some decades ago. Yes, there may be proxies in some cases still, but that's changing and changing fast. There is a huge amount, a silent revolution in our three-tiered system by which, at the end of the day, you have because another name for federalism is decentralization. And there cannot be a more humongous numbers decentralization than Panchayati Raj. The fourth has been economic liberalization. Whether you call it the 1985 watershed, but certainly the 1991 watershed. Delicensing is itself a decentralization. And although delicensing, much more needs to be done at the state levels, in the central level, today, there is automatic federalism of greatest degree because a cabinet minister in the central union government, who is the same rank as the chief minister, according to me, has only 1/3 as much power as the chief minister of a state. Everybody used to travel and fly to Delhi in those days. You don't need to. You can continue your entire industry for the lifetime of the industry without flying to Delhi, because Delhi has very limited powers today. If at all, more delicensing is required in the states. But economic liberalization has meant that there is a far greater devolution of power on the economic scene. The fifth is fiscal federalism. Again, probably the most important because that's where the shoe pinches. For a long time, the maximum devolution to states, whether by way of grants or taxes sharing or whatever Finance Commission provides, etc., was ranging from 30 to 33%. It is now 43% plus and hopes to get to 45% soon over a period of 15, 20 years. Ultimately, what matters is where the shoe pinches, where the money comes from. If devolution, irrespective of politics, and all of this has lots of drawbacks, I'm coming to that, but if in theory, if devolution has reached 43% plus, that fiscal federalism is a great flag for federalism in general, compared to where we were when the Republic of India started. And the last, the sixth, possibly equally important as the other five, is regional parties. The cacophony, the chaos, which we in the drawing rooms of Delhi think of when we think of a regional party in so-and-so state, in so-and-so state. We want uniformity, we want discipline, we want singularity. Actually, the opposite is true. Federalism is flourishing because of regional parties across the length and breadth of India, and more of India is ruled by regional parties than by the 2 or 3 central parties. Much more territory of India and much more population of India is ruled by that. Now, you may like it or not, you may have philosophy A or B, but this is federalism. The point I'm making is, from a designed constitution which is unitary, our framers never imagined where we would be in 91, post-91, where regional parties started, and today in 2023, where we are. And therefore, as I said, dissent, discomfort, and dissatisfaction, the 3 Ds, are better managed without exploding always at the top of the pressure cooker, at regional, local levels, at panchayat levels, at state levels, etc. It quarantines conflicts, and that is the big gain of federalism. But as I said, none of my pillars are complete without going from the normative, which is what I've talked about till now, to the positive under each pillar. What should be, what is designed, from what actually is happening on the ground. Now, on the ground, as far as federalism is concerned, this particular dispensation in power in the central government has popularized 2 phrases. One phrase actually, with various facets. Cooperative federalism is the mantra, especially after 2014. Cooperative federalism, unfortunately, has remained and become more and more a mantra. The actual track record is fast becoming the exact opposite. Indian federalism is under strain on several fronts, on constitutional front, on economic front, on political front, and electoral front. To the extent that several chief ministers have said that this government at the center has converted cooperative federalism into combative federalism. The union government is locked in an unsavory confrontation with several states, and we regularly find distasteful remarks, events, and occasions. Examples are diverse and manifold. The Constituent Assembly debates, which are the best place to go to whenever you have time or you are in a despairing mood, are replete with Baba Saheb's admonitions, and we celebrated his Divas just 2 days ago. Replete, saying, actually the Hindi phrase is more appropriate, Ek myan mein do talwar nahi, no 2 swords in 1 scabbard. That is the debate whenever they discuss governors. They said, we want a nominated governor because you do not want 2 swords in 1 scabbard, an elected chief minister and also an elected governor. The whole idea was to limit the gubernatorial office. And Ambedkar goes even further and says, I am scared because our design of the governor is so ornamental that I am worried that nobody will accept the post of governor. Because our design is intended to be deliberately and consciously ornamental. This was the basis of the constitutional equilibrium created by much wiser people than us in the Constituent Assembly led by Ambedkar. Let us cut to contemporary reality, especially of the last 9 years. And for those of you who haven't smelled the coffee, this is the time to smell the coffee. From Paschim Bengal to Kanyakumari, governors are on the warpath. Many criticize, indeed condemn their own state governments, and usually on Twitter. Condemn. Many delay assent to bills passed with overwhelming majority by assemblies for months without explanation. Look at this fantastic irony. If I am the governor and I have the supreme right to reject the bill, I am told not to reject the bill. Because rejection means a legislative override can apply. So what better way than not to reject, but keep it hanging like that mythological figure called Trishanku in suspended animation, neither on earth nor in the outer space. Ultimately, you know that you will have to pass it or it will be passed, whether by the courts or by you. But that time period which you gain is sufficient harassment to convert ek myan mein do talwar temporarily into two swords in one scabbard. Then again, devious and manipulative means and tactics are devised. Devious and manipulative means and tactics, I said, to send unwelcome guests to non-consensual hosts. Unwelcome guests are central government investigating agencies like CBI to non-consenting states. I am doing a series of such cases in the Supreme Court. I'll give you two examples, which should be more amusing than shocking, but they are both shocking and amusing. One of the, I'm talking obviously where I'm appearing for a non-consenting state, who is more than a non-consenting adult, who has never given consent for CBI to come. The basis given officially in the court and the argument made still to be decided by the CBI or the central government for assuming jurisdiction in one case is that although the crime happened in that state, although all the elements of the crime happened in that state, it happened near or adjacent to or on railway property. But there is no railway complainant, there is no damage to railways, nothing happened to railways. That crime happened to happen nearby and partly on railway property. Therefore, the central government has jurisdiction, therefore CBI can come in. A second very innovative example is that, yes, well before we, the CBI, registered a FIR, in CBI parlance it is called RC. They call an FIR into a regular case, RC. Well before we, the CBI, registered an RC, the consent which was historically existing had been withdrawn by the state government. Well before, months, years. But even before that withdrawal, in our own files, we had started a PE, which is a preliminary inquiry. So long as there's a preliminary inquiry on our files, and as you know in the CBI rules, the preliminary inquiry cannot get out. It's all internally, they are deciding whether to put a FIR, convert the PE into an RC. So the basis for jurisdiction to enter my home is that I had initiated a PE, you subsequently withdrew the consent. There was no FIR, no RC on that date, but I can come to your house and have dinner uninvited because I had a PE going beforehand. All these clever or too clever by half ideas are intended to convert local crimes into federal crimes. That's the constitutional principle we are talking about. And therefore, it doesn't matter whether I come to your state for one case or you go to another state. If everybody started doing this all over India, where is federalism? Why did you create Section 6 of the CBI Act, saying that you can't enter her house unless she gives you consent? We have had, friends, governments of all political colors and hues for the last 75 years. All colors, including several BJP governments prior to this BJP government. But I do not think that there have been a more direct assault on federalism by any of those governments than what we have seen in the last few years. And I'd be less than candid and truthful if I did not say so. My third pillar of democracy, which is also, this is the first institutional pillar. The others were non-institutional till now. This is the first institutional, but my third pillar is parliamentary democracy. Parliamentary democracy is two words, not one. Parliament is one word, democracy is the other word. And therefore, we have to realize that both words have to be built up, grown, advanced, not one word. In parliamentary democracy, it is the spirit which matters much more than the theory. It's not the building which matters. It's the essence of parliamentary democracy. I always say, and I'm now in my 17th year in Parliament, next year will be my 18th year, that the two ladies in Bangladesh can't sit together in their central hall. Ziaul Haq and Nawaz Sharif cannot sit together in the central hall of Pakistan. But the culture of the Indian Parliament is, at least was till some time ago, that everyone, and you would have a Rajnath Singh sitting here, you'd have Abhishek Singhvi sitting here, you'd have Arun Jaitley sitting there, you'd have a Sharad Pawar sitting here. And the other two rules were that it's the biggest gossip place in the world. You would say anything you like. Everything and anything you like and say is off the record unless I tell you to put it on the record. And all the senior journalists know that they will never violate it. They will ask you. Even the younger lot is told to be careful. Now that spirit of parliamentary democracy is something to be cherished and preserved and progressed and emulated and advanced. Unfortunately, things are going in the opposite direction. It is not possible to have that spirit if you have, along with that, trust deficit, if you have a climate of fear, if I am checking up every day on whom you are talking to and what you are talking. Therefore, this is the more amorphous part of it. The second is that even in Parliament, and we all understand politics needs optics, it needs certain things to be done for show rather than for substance. But there are parts of Parliament where that has never been true. Unfortunately, it is becoming true there also now. I have always believed, and I've been privileged to be chairman of 3 of the very important parliamentary standing committees. In 2011 of law, as was mentioned, in 2022 of home, and now in 23 of commerce, currently. It's been said in British Parliament hundreds of years ago, and in Indian Parliament also it has been true. Parliament at work is Parliament in committee, or Parliament in committee is Parliament at work. You'll be astonished at the degree of solid, real good work which can and is done in parliamentary committees, directly opposite of all the disruption you see in the House itself. I was privileged in that 2011 committee. At that time, we got one of the most controversial bills, Lokpal. I was the chair of that committee. Highly divisive, but the parliamentary committee gave a near unanimous report on 22 issues. I framed 25. On 3 issues, there was a minor dissent. That's the meaning of parliamentary committee. And when the proposal came, before Hamid Ansari's rejection, I vigorously opposed the bringing of cameras into the committee. And then subsequently, Hamid Ansari also opposed that. Because the beginning of the end of solid, real good work would start if cameras were allowed into committee meetings. And happily, we do not have that rule yet. Because people understand that you have to be bipartisan to a large degree. You have to have convergence. You have to get above your political boundaries and do the work in terms of the nitty-gritty. Unfortunately, and I say it with a certain degree of personal experience because I have, as I said, chaired and am chairing 3 committees. That bipartisanship, even in parliamentary committees, which is of a very high order, is diminishing. It has to diminish when the members are told that you are ultimately agents of a party and you are not really members of a parliamentary committee. That, again, is a very sad change which I hope is arrested sooner rather than later. I have had views and suggestions about reform in Parliament. I think the rigor of the whip should be reduced. The whip actually kills creativity. What is the whip? The whip is required to prevent governments falling. It's completely understandable. If there is a money bill and people don't attend and vote according to the party view, the government will fall. Certainly you should have a whip for those things. But today a whip for anything and everything means that you are stultifying and strangulating and gagging creativity. This is a reform we must experiment with. You must limit the whip to a few core issues where the government is not endangered. If you do that, the amount of creativity, originality and innovation of parliamentarians has to be seen to be believed in the House. But a lot of people cannot speak, cannot give their views, cannot be creative, cannot be out-of-the-box thinking, cannot think in a particular way because there is a general whip. That is one reform I think we should experiment with. It can be calibrated, it can be safeguarded. It did not at all affect the original purpose of the whip, which was to ensure that governments don't fall on trivial reasons. The other is also to consider a very clear specified standard and not these judicial pronouncements which decide when and who will be disqualified how. You know, different judgments have really created situations. Now I understand that in India, conviction is sometimes the closest to eternity. So you cannot say that a member of parliament, a representative of the people should be disqualified only after conviction, because conviction doesn't happen frequently or doesn't happen ever sometimes. But equally, you cannot start disqualifying people on stages much before conviction. So, and it doesn't matter which one you do, it's a matter of legislation, not judicial pronouncements, which becomes vague, ad hoc, episodic, and case-wise. Why not have a simple line? That's the other reform I have always advocated. Whatever the line you draw, my own line would be that you will stand disqualified if A, charges are framed against you, not charge sheet is filed, but charges are framed against you by a competent court. B, those charges are framed qua certain specified offences. The offences must be specified, not anything and everything. And C, if you want, you can specify the period of time also, of punishment, etc. This would make it a more core, because there are all classes of political so-called crimes committed by politicians, and sometimes this power is being used in a completely trivialized and non-appropriate manner. But before I leave Parliament, let me again come back to the current situation. There is a far more important issue on parliamentary democracy than we tend to think about. I've talked about, as I said, the positive side, the institutional pillar of democracy and the origins and the reform in a theoretical sense. But let's look at practical. What is Parliament? It's the temple of democracy. What is democracy? It is part of the basic structure, level playing field, free and fair elections. That's the heart of our democracy. So this institutional pillar is very important. But have we thought of the reality and what it is doing to this fundamental pillar of Indian democracy? Are we talking of a theoretical equality and not a real equality, as Marie Antoinette did, saying that if they don't have bread, let them eat cakes? That's also equality. But do we really have a level playing field in Parliament and for parliamentarians when, if a somewhat dated figure, and this figure is worse now, I don't have the latest figure, in 2019-20, the Association for Democratic Reform said that the BJP had received 2,600 crores from quote-unquote unknown sources. And 78%, this 2,600 crores, was 78% of the total receipts of 7 other national parties. But a different statistic is even more telling. This great grand innovation of electoral bonds, 2018 to 22, 4 years, the BJP has received more than 50% of all electoral bonds. The next party in sequence has received 10%, so 50 to 10. The third party, the TMC of Bengal, has received 8%. The question is not how much you received. The question is, what is happening to a level playing field when you are having a theoretical equality, one man, one vote, one seat, one man. But is that a theoretical equality like cakes and bread, or is it a real equality? Consequent to this, of course, are all the other things. Let's turn to advertising. The BJP, the ruling party, has been found by BARC to be the biggest advertiser in the last 5 years In a particular week, they test this by weekly insertions. In a particular week in November 2018, they've had 22,000 plus insertions. That is the number of times an advertisement is aired on TV, which is twice the number which the biggest advertiser in the country has ever done, Netflix. Netflix has done 11,000 at the highest. This has done 22,000. This is for the week of 12th to 16th November 2018. It is spending about 140 million US dollars on publicity per year, with 43% of this expenditure on print ads. This I have lots, one can go on statistics, they're a little dated in fact, you can have more statistics. The vital constitutional question I raise is, if basic structure theory postulates a level playing field and is considered essential for democracy, then opaque structures like electoral bonds have already violated this basic structure and have already decimated the very concept of parliamentary democracy, because no party can even dream of coming close to the economic power wielded by the ruling party, either at the center or in opposition in the states. Consequently, courts have to determine this yesterday, the validity of these bonds yesterday, whereas actually we are having it languishing for over 5 years. Another facet of parliamentary democracy before I move on to the next pillar. I have only heard once or twice in any parliamentary democratic system that the ruling party officially states that we will not allow parliament to function unless a leading member of the opposition first apologizes. Mark the two parts of this sentence. I, the ruling party, will not allow parliament to function. The second part of the sentence is, unless you prior apologize. Now, I have never, if you actually analyze this sentence, it is amazing that it's happening in India for the last several months. This is apart from the fact that you can sue him for defamation, you can send him for jail for sedition, you can call him anti-national. But you cannot allow parliament to function and you can't be allowed to speak, Mr. So-and-so, in this case Rahul Gandhi, unless you give a prior apology. How, of what principle of parliamentary democracy can this be justified? There's another batch of persons, and I'll not say much because I'm also in the Privileges Committee. That batch of persons has either received privilege notices, and in one case a lady has been suspended beyond the completion of the last session. Suspension beyond the session is rare. The lady in question accepted that inadvertently she had filmed and apologized unconditionally and profusely. So at the worst, in the session which ended 2 weeks ago, her suspension should have, or her reference to privileges should have ended. But the suspension is continuing on the ground on the stated reason that they are now trying to find out who uploaded it or under whose instructions, when the actual act of culpability, the filming, has been accepted, adopted, and apologized for. In any case, the larger issue in all this related to parliamentary democracy, which I hold to be the most cherished value, is forgotten. And that larger issue is cooperation, consensus, cordiality. They all appear to be words of a bygone era. Magnanimity seems an alien word. Ego, arrogance, and confrontation based on numbers, on majorities, have taken their place. As I said, there are precedents of the same ruling party in power at the center where the spirit of parliamentary democracy was understood very, very, very differently. I turn now to judiciary. I did say I'll take long, but I'll take a little bit more time because I'm going to speed up, but it'll take a little bit more time. The next, this as I told you, is the job of a fan dancer. The topic is so large. I'm only touching upon the organs and then leaving it, but I need to touch upon these institutional pillars. The next is judiciary, which of course, as you know, is the most remarkable, the one most trusted by our system, the one with the highest trust quotient, and with avant-garde doctrines of judicial review matched by no other judicial institution on planet Earth. You know, Marbury Madison came in the 18th century early in USA, and they were exulting and dancing with joy about judicial review in Marbury Madison in the US Supreme Court. If you see the judicial review powers of the Indian Supreme Court, not now but for the last 25, 30 years, it would make 20 Marbury Madisons blush. There is no comparison. It's the most powerful court. It has, as I said, created doctrines like the basic structure, which says even a constitutional amendment can be unconstitutional. It has progressed a whole new jurisprudence of PILs, now almost 30 years old, etc., etc. The two scourges of this institutional pillar of Indian democracy, one is arrears, which makes us hang our head in shame when on the one hand you have basic structure, you have PIL, you have all these doctrines. On the other hand, you have these humongous arrears. Palkhiwala always believed that words must be an assault on the senses. For reform to happen, you need to have an assault on the senses, even though people might not like to hear them. So he said, the pace of disposal of cases in India would be considered unduly slow in a community of snails. He then added that if litigation were added in the Olympics as a sport, India would win a gold medal every year. He further added that the closest interaction with eternity which anybody can ever have while living is to be part of a litigation. Now, these are harsh words. In current context, they may even, Palkhiwala might even have been hauled off for being anti-national. But they are true, and they must make our head hang in shame. And the Supreme Court is not really the test and the comparator, because we are told Supreme Court has done so many things. Supreme Court is doing marvelous work, actually, with so many things. Their arrears are a total of 65, 70,000. The real problem is our 22, 23 high courts, and the much bigger problem is our district judiciary, wrongly called the subordinate judiciary. With all the lectures, with all the sermons, with all the seminars, with all the functions, with all the tears and congratulatory pats on the back, our arrears has risen just immediately pre-COVID at about 3 point something crores, just over 3 crores, to 4.25 crores. We've actually had a 1.25 crore net increase of pendency, as if 3 crores was already not dismal enough. Of those 3 crores at that time, 2.5 crores were in the district judiciary, 50 odd lakhs in the high courts put together, and 65 odd thousand, less than a lakh, less than 75 in the Supreme Court. Most of this has again happened in both the high courts and the district judiciary. The reasons are well known, and we keep on having seminars and discussions, but we're not able to address them. After 10 years of beating a stick, the Supreme Court has increased the judge per million population ratio from 10 per million, 10 judges per million or 11 judges per million. It has crawled after 12 years of constant judicial mandamuses to 20 per million. The minimum ideal is supposed to be either 50 per million or at least 35, 40 per million. It is like saying that you have excellent hospitals with the latest equipment but no doctors. I don't understand how patients will be treated. There are so many other reasons. In the zeal to be seen as pro-public, we create laws like 138 and 498A. Parliament has now turned full circle and it is considering how to modify those same laws, because they found that the two biggest pendencies, and here you have very eminent criminal people sitting here, criminal law people, and there, they will tell you that the numbers in those two sections alone are constituting the bulk of the criminal law pendency. There are any number of cases in the Supreme Court which go to a division bench, which is 2 judges, and are referred to 3 judges. And they have to be referred first to 3 judges where reference is required. And then they're referred to 5 judges. You can't refer 2 to 5 directly, and sometimes to 7. But the beauty of it is that the period taken to refer from 2 to 3, 3 to 5, 5 to 7, which is about 4 years or 3 years or 5 years, in between spawns hundreds of High Court judgments. The poor High Court judge is not quite sure whether he should follow the two-judge bench or the reference or the further reference, and it spawns litigation, and by the time the five-judge bench order comes, all of those hundreds of cases in the High Courts have to be reversed. These are practical but real issues of pendency. As has been put more cynically but more emphatically in the Hindi proverb, दोपहर तक बिक गया बाजार का हर झूठ, दोपहर तक बिक गया बाजार का हर झूठ, और मैं एक सच को लेकर शाम तक बैठा रहा. This is unfortunately the sight of the litigant sitting stoically before the court for justice. Barring now, and I've been writing on this for a long time, and I was privileged to find that one of my articles on arrears and what I call reforms in the administration of justice has been cited in a very important judgment on this subject by Justice Kaul. Now, for the first time, they have woken up to the idea of using Article 224A, an article of the Constitution amended decades ago in the 60s, but never, I think, to my knowledge, used in any High Court, maybe once or twice in 50 years. Used in the Supreme Court 4 or 5 times, namely appointing ad hoc judges. When you are taking time and politics is taking over and you're not able to appoint judges, you have a provision for ad hoc judges who can deal with the backlog in some better way. But friends, again, the reality of the judiciary of course has had periods of threat, frequently more from within and less from without. But the current government sniping at the judicial institution appears to be continuous, strategic, organized, and calibrated. It has all the characteristics of an organized image assassination assault. And ironically, it is by no less than the central government. I don't think we can avoid stating clearly that it has full approbation and sponsorship at the highest quarters. One day, a particular constitutional authority questions the basic structure doctrine itself. Something now, Keshwanan Bharati was, so now 50 years old, 74 to now. A constitutional authority questions the necessity, existence, need, efficacy of that. The next day, no less than the law minister considers that either he should be able to sit on the collegium or the collegium should be abolished. A third day, the same constitutional functionary suggests obliquely that a certain class of retired Supreme Court judges are a threat to the nation or well-being or governance, and so on and so forth. It is quite astonishing that this kind of thinking by persons who have no stake and are not part of the legal ecosystem is happening day in, day out. Because for all the warts and all the shortcomings and all the negatives which I have myself itemized, the judiciary cannot be chipped away at day in and day out by constitutional functionaries because it is the most valued institution of our system. And it is something where I believe that those who believe in control freak approaches are finding that there is one institution where they are not able to exercise full control freakism. And therefore, some of this sniping has increased in intensity and focus. Consequently, the pushback from civil society, from all other parts of India, have to be equally organized, synergical, and thought out, because unfortunately, and this is my own view, this is a bastion which the government is eyeing avariciously. Of course, there is no doubt that the judiciary also has to introspect. Nobody is suggesting it doesn't. The judiciary has to examine its image and ask itself that is it always justifying the, I would call it, excessive trust placed by the citizenry in the judiciary. For that, the judiciary has to walk the talk and to give last mile relief. it is not enough to sermonize or lament or to turn back after going 3/4 of the way, but not giving effective relief. Take, for example, the second-time recommendations of judges to the High Court, which have been returned once. We have heard this for the last 5-7 years. What's the point of lamenting again and again? What's the point of sermonizing? What's the point of threatening? And one former Chief Justice cried from a podium like this about it. Actually cried. I have written then and earlier that if in one case, on a return or delay of a second reiterated recommendation, a notice of contempt is issued, not to the constitutional functionary in the first place, but to the law secretary, you will possibly find this stopping. But if you substitute the contempt notice, because it is clear as crystal clear that unless those judgments are overruled, the jurisdiction to act on a second returned reiterated recommendation is zero. There is no power. But if you substitute, for whatever reason, contempt notice by lament, sermon, or helplessness, then you are not going to cure this. That is what I mean, that you have to have last mile connectivity if you have a principle which has to be implemented. Second, and similarly, the judiciary, and it doesn't matter which way they decide. They decide in your favor, they decide in my favor. That is not the point. They have to decide matters of burning moment pending with them. Avoidance is also a decision. Default is also a decision. Delay is also a decision. But these are not three forms of decision making for which the citizenry of this country has excessive faith in you. And the more such cases grow, and one of them I've just talked about, a 5-year delay in deciding electoral bonds issue, without which directly impinges on basic structure. For that matter, deciding, again, this way or that way doesn't matter, whether you can convert a state, a pre-existing state, into a union territory. Or indeed citizenship issues. Or indeed other level playing field issues. A decision is where things will be set right. And a delay or an avoidance or a non-decision or a pendency is where suspicion, fear, and deprecation will happen. As I leave the judiciary, I must regretfully add something which I saw, heard, and yesterday, as late as yesterday. The courts, according to me, have to necessarily stand up for liberty, for progressive and liberal values, for protection of the core values of our polity. If the judiciary has to do that, then consider what happened yesterday. In James Bond terms, as they said, first time is happenstance, second time is coincidence, third time is enemy action. That's one of the famous James Bond films. I don't know, it's Goldfinger or one of those films. Now, is it coincidence, happenstance, or is it enemy action that 4 of the accused in a particular murder of Mr. Pal have already been liquidated? 2 more, including a son, was liquidated 2 days ago. And 2 more, including a father, were liquidated yesterday. Of course, all this is done without charges being framed, without trial, forget conviction. And let me tell you, I am a relative conservative regarding criminal matters. I believe such persons should be hanged if they are guilty. I genuinely believe that. And I have not opposed the death penalty because I believe bad crimes, really bad crimes, do deserve the death penalty. But can they be hanged by elimination while talking to a video with policemen surrounding them intended to protect them? Is this the idea of India on which a sitting minister of the UP government yesterday says, कई चीज़ों का हिसाब इसी जन्म में पूरा हो जाता है. You all understand enough Hindi to understand what I'm saying. Many accounts are closed in the same life on earth. Is this the concept of rule of law, because I'm now talking of judiciary, which we can have in a country like India, where the chief minister of a state larger than Europe exults in this kind of liquidation? We of course have all kinds of stories now. You can say that somebody in the crowd like you picked up a gun and shot me. Some desperate victim's family shot me. Some XYZ gangster shot me. That all will hone by inquiry. But it is not possible to believe that 8 people involved as accused or co-accused in the murder of a person have not faced trial, not faced conviction, not faced charge sheets in many cases, and have been liquidated in the midst of those people who are there to actually protect them. This is where the judiciary's entire existence, according to me, is tested, because if rule of law and faith in rule of law dies, then all these grand institutional pillars of democracy I'm talking about are nothing but words. Friends, I have 2 more and I'm done. I'm very sorry, but this is a big topic. I'll take a few more minutes. The next is, of course, media, the other great institutional pillar of Indian democracy. Now, some of the harsh words I'm about to use are fully justified but restricted to certain sections of the media. Don't get me wrong. Fortunately, this country is alive and kicking because there are large sections of the media which don't fall under my criticism, fortunately. But today, it is important for me to say something which I never thought would be necessary to say. It would be obvious to any journalist verse to say he doesn't need to go to his school of my friend here. Doesn't have to be a trained journalist to know this. That you cannot be a spokesperson of ideologies. You cannot be a person acting for vested interests or authorities. You cannot allow direct political conflict to affect your views. You cannot become a participant from an anchor. I don't think you require rocket science or attending a school or diploma course to know all this. All of you have practiced it for so many decades. But today, we have reached the stage where we have to repeat these things, these elementary principles. The media, large sections of it, and in particular visual, has become much, much more sensationalism and much, much less sense. Less sense, more sensationalism. They've become judge, jury, prosecutor, executioner, executor. With, and this is again a dated figure, I think is much more now, with 515 TV channels, with 500 million at peak time viewers, probably 600 million now. Imagine the effect you are having on free speech, fair speech, level playing field, if you have this kind of approach. The biggest culprit in an institutional sense is this miracle, which many of you know about, but which is continuing merrily without any solution. This miracle called TRP. The TRP, something so obviously a fraud, is flourishing. And people don't realize that the TRP ultimately determines content. Because those 40,000 meters for a country the size of India, 125 crores, I've always said, people deserve a Nobel Prize for miniaturization. For a 125 crore country, you measure viewership patterns by some 40,000 meters. If that is not a Nobel Prize for miniaturization, what is? But the TRP ultimately is not by itself bad. It leads to content decisions. Because what the TRP shows is what you will produce in content. Because content in turn decides the advertisements, or the advertisement in turn starts deciding the content. What does it ultimately lead to? It leads to a toxic triangle of revenue, of fake viewership patterns, and of content. To this toxic triangle, if you add liberal doses of politics, of glamour, of premeditated and motivated stands of journalists, insidious government control, ambitious anchors, people baying for the blood, then what more heady cocktail can you get? A cocktail which would put a mix of rum, vodka, and any other form of alcohol to shame. This is actually the truth, at least of the visual media, to a large extent. And we seem to be able to do nothing about it. We did not have the phrase called Godi media, at least when I started in this game in the media. But I only rightly hear Godi media for large sections. And I find no error in 90% of that characterization, so that I can call it a mischaracterization. No. It certainly wasn't true when I started in the pre-Obi Van days. The Press Council of India is another miracle. A toothless tiger, actually worse than a toothless tiger, but a toothless tiger at least roars. The PCI can do nothing as far as the print is concerned. It only continues with a incestuous conspiratorial silence. So friends, of course the sub judice rule died long ago. There is no such thing as a sub judice rule. The real point about the media is that either we have to address the issue, because another fundamental level playing field, or what makes for a level playing field of democracy itself, is the media. It's not called the fourth estate for nothing. It is given the status alongside the judiciary, the executive, and the legislature, because it directly affects democracy. Either you have to have the guts to bring in things like a broadcasting bill. Broadcasting bill, incidentally, is the longest pending bill, one of the longest pending bills in Parliament. It clarifies conflicts of interests. Or you have to make demarcations. You have to make Chinese walls between ownership, between interest, between how you run it. There are drafts available, but nobody has the guts to pass them. Freedom House, which must be most maligned, puts India 2 on a 4-point scale for free and independent media under the present dispensation. In 2020, people tend to forget because our institutional memory is short, several journalists were jailed for being critical of the Government of India's and the Prime Minister's policy on the second wave, a period now forgotten and consigned to the dustbin. We are all supposed to believe that the raids on the BBC happened because of a past inquiry ongoing, as if all of us eat grass. All platform providers now face clear withdrawal of the exemption for safe harbor. If an external government body decides that you should take off fake news and you don't take it off, whether it is fake news or not is a decision by external elements. Today, we have the strange spectacle that on the one hand, you have a whole class of journalists, and especially in the visual media, who depend, survive, and flourish only on handouts of the government. You have a similar class which asks the most amusing, fawning, and friendly questions to government ministers with no cross-examination, no follow-up, no intrusiveness. It frequently looks like the worst form of Noora Kushti invented, but that passes off for press freedom, for media independence. These are harsh words, but as Palkhiwala said, words have to be assault on the senses for reform to follow. And I believe that this is far too valuable an organ, which is now completely under subordination, large sections of it, which is now completely under a climate of fear, etc. The last two institutional bodies are, in fact the last three, I can take them together, are the Election Commission, the CAG, and the Army. I only want to say that the Election Commission generally, again, is India's pride. It's the world's envy. It's a fantastic organization doing this remarkable logistics work with millions of people voting in elections. They are frequently consulted, and I told a former chief election commissioner that if you could charge consultancy fees, you'd be the most employed, because every country wants to hire our election commission to conduct their elections. But we have to guard against politicization of this body, irrespective of the political color at the center. I'll give you two examples where unfortunately that standard has not been met, but still there is time, and the recent judgment of the Supreme Court deserves accolade for making at least a step in that direction, namely the selection process being more independent and more inclusive. The two examples I wanted to give you was in 2019 general elections. I was in particular looking at the Election Commission, and there were about 30 to 40 complaints at a higher level about misuse of the Model Code of Conduct violation. And I led some delegations to complain. And actually in 30 of those complaints we made, in more than 70% prompt action was taken, which is either to stop or to say there is nothing wrong, or otherwise to say that you are not barred from campaigning for 2 or 3 days. You remember that Model Code of Conduct, everything is all about speed, because the window is 6 weeks. There's no point punishing you afterwards, because if you can campaign during that time, then you got away with your wrongdoing. 10 of those 35, 40 complaints related to the Prime Minister and the Home Minister. In those 10 complaints, there was simply no decision for 4 of those 6 weeks, which is the window for the 2019 elections. In the last 2 weeks, we approached the Supreme Court. Supreme Court has to follow a procedure, notice this, that, other. A direction was given. And 1 week left, the matters were taken up. They were ultimately dismissed in most cases against us with a dissent. This footnote is very interesting. There was a 2-1 order in these 5-7 cases involving the Prime Minister and the Home Minister. The 2-1 order, first, the dissent was not made available, and a letter was issued saying the practice of the Election Commission is not to share dissents with you. That's how a very good Election Commission episode ended, with 2 exceptions of the 9th schedule, the Prime Minister and the Home Minister. What happened after that is a nice footnote also. 3 to 4 months later, that dissenting member started having reports against him in several newspapers. We all know the name, you all know the person. He was then subject to several reopened inquiries by 2 central agencies. And ultimately, a person who would have become CEC and had 2 years left was made to look as if he had opted for an Asian Development Bank job at Manila, where he still continues. He had still time left in the EC, and he would become the Chief Election Commissioner. This is where you have to guard against. I'm giving you live examples because the institution is there. Our 323, 324, the powers are very large in our constitution. By and large, it's done good work. But when push comes to shove, which is the example I gave you, you have to show, as I said, vitamin G, which is guts. Of course, the army is our most cherished institution. Its strength is its anonymity. Its strength is anonymity. You don't think of the army when you talk in India. You don't think of the army when you think in UK. As long as you keep it that way, it is good. If ever once they taste blood, it is the beginning of the end of democracy. So please don't politicize our army. Any politicization by Rambo statements, by jingoistic chest thumping, by making it appear as if my promotion to Chief of Army Staff or Chief of all the 3 forces depends on how jingoistic I sound, will all be the beginning of the end of this cherished institution, because anonymity, rock solid behind us, is the whole strength of the army. That has been the tradition of India, and we have to keep it that way. I'm only sounding a note of caution and fear, but I think it's an important guideline. Well, friends, I've actually come to the last 2 points, and this is not a lawyer's promise, it's an actual promise. Before I come to the actual conclusion, let me make the penultimate point, which I have put here under the heading fear. As I near the end of this lecture, I'd be failing in my duty if I did not mention that fear is antithetical to democracy. It is decimative of rule of law. It is destructive of each of the many institutional or non-institutional pillars which I have talked about. The true test of any ruling dispensation, is not how much GDP it has increased, but how much, even marginally, GDF it has decreased. Gross domestic fear. That is really a measure of its success. Sadly, this indicator, instead of decreasing, seems to be continuously on the rise in the last 9 years. GDF. And it is directly antithetical to that poem by the great man, the bearded man, who gave the title of Mahatma to Gandhi. Which kind of India did he expect us to awaken in that famous Nobel-winning Gitanjali? What you are seeing is the antithesis. And what is that antithesis? Dossier Raj, micromanagement, daily misuse of agencies, eavesdropping, control of content, sedition charges, defamation suits, citizens moving from mobile calls to WhatsApp calls to FaceTime calls, Raid Raj, privacy intrusion, death or bodily harm threats successfully carried out for what you speak, what you write, what you eat, what you wear, what you think, how you communicate. The list is endless, friends. How can democracy, how can our pillars of democracy, institutional or non-institutional, coexist in this all-pervasive climate of fear? How can either Tagore or Mahatma Gandhi, much less the ordinary citizen, hold his head high in the utopia which Tagore imagined? Well, friends, I have now come to the end. I confess, despite the length of this speech, done no more than the job of a fan dancer. A fan dancer draws attention to the subject without really covering the subject. Each of my pillars is enough for a separate lecture by itself. Personally, I believe that India's amazing diversity is its best insurance against degeneration of democracy or institutionalization of dictatorship. The intrinsic nature of India and Indians is argumentative, is diverse, is not conformist, is anti-uniformity. And that is also our strength. Our democracy and Gandhi's vision of that democracy still has many miles to walk. It has many promises to keep. It, of course, can be and should be castigated as an imperfect democracy. But equally, it has to be lauded for the remarkable achievements which we, being the only country of those 30, 40 countries emerging from the yoke of imperialism, have managed to inaugurate. All our founding fathers, including Gandhi, would be both happy and sad. Of course, Gandhi is an extreme example because in 48 itself, he felt that there should be a winding up petition for all political parties. In 1948 itself, he wrote that all political parties should be wound up. As I said, he was an over-idealistic person. But despite all roadblocks, all various deviations, objections, obstructions, despite feeling that you are sometimes in a minority of one, Gandhi needs to be emulated because he would never have stopped nudging, pushing to make the India of our dreams. Gandhi would have picked up the phrase from the man who conferred the title of Mahatma on him, Ekla Chalo, by Tagore. He would have either cited Ekla Chalo do your thing. Or he would have picked up Iqbal's words, मैं अकेला ही चला था, जानिब मंजिल, लोग आते रहे और कारवां बनता रहा. Even though I was the sole person, I kept walking. People kept joining, and we ultimately had a multitude, a caravan. Gandhi teaches us that you have to persist tenaciously and doggedly before reform takes place. In fact, it was he who said that all reform processes must pass the tortuous path of 5 stages. And it's the 5th stage till which you have to persist. First, indifference. Second, ridicule. Third, abuse. Fourth, repression. And finally, 5th, respect. Therefore, friends, there is no better way than to persist on that path, despite the obstacles, despite the feeling of despair, despite the likelihood that you feel that you will never reach the end of the road, because ultimately, he can't be wrong. And the values which this democracy stands for cannot be wrong. Thank you very much indeed. My apologies for a very long lecture.